Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Rukshana Nanakara. I am the Global Policy and Advocacy Expert at International Land Coalition. I'm incredibly thankful to Transparency International, Alice and her team for putting this session together, because this is a very special session because we're actually going to talk about some of the ground issues in terms of land corruption. So why do we really want to talk about land corruption here? I just want to put some facts and figures out there so you know the gravity of the issue. Did you know that every week 4 land and environmental defenders have been killed in the world? So that means, according to our partner Global Witness, in year 2021, more than 200 people have been killed for standing for the planet that we all share. So this is the gravity of the problem. So I also just want to put some figure out here. According to my organization's research, we have an initiative called Land Matrix, where we look at land grabbing issues and how land investment is happening in key land basin countries, including Brazil, Cameroon, Colombia, DRC, Indonesia, and Central African Republic. Only 29% of the investors actually looked at VGGTs in terms of their investments. If any one of you think what VGGTs are, it's a voluntary guideline came up with state parties in relation to land tenure, to govern land tenure and land governance. So I also just want to make mention the fact that we are living in an era of climate change, and that has huge impact on land. So we talk about climate change mitigation, adaptation. Also we talked about in terms of net zero programs and carbon offsetting programs. All these programs are land-based. They are highly land intensive. So land is at risk. So this session is also important because we keep talking about corruption as a cross-cutting theme. But when we talk about hunger, when you talk about education, water issues, climate change, land is also a cross-cutting theme. So this session, I feel that it's kind of special because these two sessions thematic areas are coming together in this session, and we are very happy to get 3 people actually to talk about some of the ground issues and issues of people that they are working with in their day-to-day work. So I just want to first introduce the 3 speakers, and I'll just tell you how we are going to run this session. So we got to my right side, far out there, Tafadzwa Chikumbu. He's the Executive Director of Transparency International Zimbabwe. He's the development economist with several years of experience in development work with a focus on gender equality, anti-corruption, extractive industries, and human rights-based approaches, among a lot of other things that he does. He has contributed extensively to the body of knowledge on governance in Africa through research, and has coordinated projects on fiscal transparency involving partners in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. To my immediate right-hand side, I got Kate Rafitoson. She's the Executive Director and TI Madagascar. Kate, so good to have you, because we do know that you are getting threats recently for the work that we have been doing in Madagascar, so we're very happy to see you here and safe. And we really want to extend our support to your work here. She has been heading the local chapter of Transparency International Madagascar since 2018. She holds a PhD in political science and a second one in social sciences applied to development. She's a democratic activist and a human rights defender, and she also strives for women's political empowerment and is a national coordinator for the Malagasy Publish What You Pay coalition. Um, Promoting extractive industries accountability is part of her work, and transparency and greater governance is one of her focuses in a larger context. She advocates for a just energy transition theory adapted to the global south needs and context. So thank you for being here, both of you. And to my left-hand side, we got Joachim Stassart. He's a researcher of the Socio-environmental Integrity Program of Transparency International Brazil. And Joachim is one of the lead researchers of Transparency International chapter in Brazil on land governance and environmental crimes. Over the past few years, he has conducted research on the nexus between corruption and the environment in different topics, including land grabbing and related deforestation, the climate agenda, wildlife trafficking, illegal mining, and the extractive industries in Brazil. Last year with TI Brazil, he published a report on the connection between corruption, poor land governance, and land grabbing in Brazil. So I think it's worth taking that time just to say that these three people who are here have enormous amount of experience working in their countries at national level. And also what is special about them is that they also day-to-day deal with people who are taking the large brunt of corruption and climate change issues. So what I'm going to do is I will ask a set of questions from these three speakers, and then we will open the discussion. In asking these questions, we will be focusing on why do we need to talk about land grabbing and land corruption, and its effects on people, and how we can find solutions. This is how we're going to run the session. And as we run the session, if you want to tweet about it, if you want to put anything which is coming out of this session on social media, please feel free to do that. And you can see the hashtags there. We have hashtag Stop Land Corruption, hashtag Land Corruption, and hashtag IACC 2022. So please support us to spread the message across. All right. So I'm going to turn to Joachim first. Joachim, tell us a little bit about, because you do a lot of work in Brazil, how does land corruption and land grabbing look like in Brazil, and its effects on people, its real effects on people?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I feel very privileged to be part of this panel and with all those experts. So land grabbing is a very important issue in Brazil because it's one of the main driver of land conflict in Brazil. Ruchana mentioned the data of Global Witness, but Brazil is actually the country that had the greater number of killings of land and environmental defenders over the last decades. There were, according to the data of Global Witness that are probably underestimate the issue, there were 342 killings of land and environmental defenders in Brazil. And according to Global Witness, those conflicts are driven by land rights and forest rights in Brazil. According to local NGOs, those land conflicts are also increasing, and they are recording more than 1,000 land conflicts every year in Brazil right now. But land grabbing is not only an issue for the people, but also for the environment. And for climate change, as Ruchana mentioned, because unlike most countries in the world, Brazil greenhouse gas emissions are not principally driven by the energy sector, but by land use change. Around 46% of the greenhouse gas emission in Brazil are coming from land use change, and this is principally deforestation and forest degradation. And we don't have very precise data about land grabbing. It's occurring behind the closed doors, so you don't really know. But we have proxy. We know that there's about 50% of deforestation that occurs in public land, and this is considered to be an approximation of land grabbing, because when public land are invaded, it's often followed by the replacement of forest by cattle. So this is about why do we need to talk about land grabbing, but now I want to talk about why land grabbing is connected to corruption. So and this is actually what land grabbing looks like in Brazil. So I think it's interesting to see. So we have conducted research at Transparency International Brazil to understand how land corruption is driving land grabbing, and we have identified 3 forms of corruption schemes that make land grabbing possible in Brazil. So the 2 first forms of corruption schemes that are making land grabbing possible actually are seeking to obtain a fraudulent land title that appears to be lawful. And there are 2 ways to do that. The first way is to insert fraudulent data in land cadastre, especially when you don't have, when there's no data about who is the legitimate occupant of the area, but also through fraud in land records that can be facilitated by a range of corrupt actors such as lawyers, notaries, but also judges, and so on. And so the second form that you can obtain a fraudulent title that appears to be lawful is through land regularization process, because a lot of there's a lot of informality in the land sector in Brazil. So there's a very important regularization process, and land grabbers can take advantage of that to claim to be. They usually use frontmen so that they can make false declaration and to fit in the regularization criteria and to obtain a title, but those titles are actually just serving the land grabber that are pulling the string behind the scene. And then the third form of corruption that is connected to land grabbing is actually less connected to these administrative and legal aspect, but it's related to the actual process of physically invading and the land grabbed area and taking advantage of this area. So there are quite, so how corruption relates to that? So the first form, it's possible to have some law enforcement official that close their eyes on the invasion of those land grabbed area, but also to have officials from police officers that are actually part of private militia that are joining land grabbers to exhort or to expose the legitimate occupant of those areas. So I think that's the 3 main forms of corruption that can make land grabbing possible in Brazil.
Yep, thank you. And I think it has enormous adverse impact on people's lives, right? So what we explained was a collusion of different parties in Brazil in terms of land grabbing. I just want to divert a little bit towards the era that we are living in, which is the era of climate change. And it's a topic that we all have to focus on and that we cannot avoid, right? So as I said, when we talk about climate change, carbon offsetting programs or net zero programs, it can be like wind power, it can be storing carbon, it can be putting up solar panels. In all those issues, land come as a key topic, right? Because all these programs are extremely land intensive. Tell us a little bit about how all these programs have kind of contributed to land grabbing in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting question because with the new coming government, there's a lot of discussion about carbon market, how we can invest in Brazil and to protect the forest and to offset emission of other countries or other companies. But I think the land issue is lacking from the debate because how are we going to issue carbon credit if we're not sure about who is owning the land? And how are we going to be sure that we're not paying for a land grabber instead of a local community that is actually responsible for preserving the forest? And I just want to mention an example that was very interesting. So an example of the carbon credit that was issued by an international company. It was certified by international standard for carbon credit. and it was, so it looked very nice on the paper, and it was part of the portfolio of the international company that was sold to global companies such as Air France or Santander and so on. But some investigative journalists have shown that not only the carbon credit was based on a fraudulent title, but also it was located on the land of a local community that was actually formally recognized by the state. So not only the company that issues the carbon credit claim to be the owner of this land without having the right to do so, but it also excluded the community from this process and make money on their back. So I think it's very important to consider this issue when we talk about carbon markets, because it's not only that it can be totally inefficient or ineffective, but it can also drive land grabbing and foster future land grabbing in Brazil.
Thank you, Joachim. I think you made 2 points. One is that how important it is for people to have tenure rights in that context, right? To secure their land. It can be individual or territorial, and they become less vulnerable in terms of land grabbing if you have secure land rights. And also, none of these programs, when it's come to net zero programs or carbon offsetting programs, should pave the way for land grabbing issues, right? That's a fundamental. I think we will have a chance to talk about it more. I'm going to move to another country, Madagascar. Kate, brilliant that you are here, as I said. We just want to ask, how does it look like in Madagascar, the situation in terms of land grabbing?
Okay, thank you, Roxana, and hey everyone, happy to be here. So you have to first understand a little bit the context in Madagascar. Land is considered by the population as a sacred thing. It is what we own as Malagasy people. But the levels of education is also very low in Madagascar, and because of this lack of instruction, people are not aware of the procedures for acquiring a land title, so land tenure is still problematic. Only a low rate, almost 20% of the population own their land. So they own it just traditionally, but they don't have an official title. So it exposes them and increases vulnerability to land grabbing. And there are different types of land grabbing in Madagascar. The ones which are made by large companies working with a license or permit from the government, but which grab the land without any kind of consultation or consent from the community. But there is also another form of land grabbing from the government itself by the eviction, forced eviction of large communities from the land that the government wants to use for any kind of purpose. We have such case, for instance, in Antananarivo, the capital city of Madagascar, where the government intends to create a new city and then evicted already a large number of population without their consent, and there are protests going on. The high prevalence of corruption in the land sector has been documented already by our research and also by other organizations across the years. And we can see an increased number of grievances in our ALAC centers, the advice and legal assistance centers that we run through our chapter. There are a lot more of people complaining about corruption in the land sector, and this corruption takes the form of fraudulent land titles, as explained by Joachim beforehand, and all documents are then falsified. It is very easy in Madagascar for anyone to bribe land officials, and there are lots of politically exposed people who want to grab larger plots of land because it is easy for them to do so. They bribe judges, the land officials, the policemen, people from the gendarmerie to do so. So I'm going to talk about two cases of land grabbing specifically. The first one is related to the Mena Bay Anti-Mena protected area, which is located in the western region of Madagascar. This area covers about 20,000 hectares of dry forest, succulent woodland, mangroves, and secondary grassland and scrub. You see already in the picture that it is not doing very good. This is already the result of the deforestation happening out there, eased by corruption. And this forest also includes a northern portion of the Kirindi forest and the avenue of baobabs. When you think of Madagascar, you have those beautiful trees, the baobab tree. This is home of the baobab trees, who are now disappearing totally from the landscape because of corruption and land grabbing and deforestation. So in this area, large areas have been illegally logged, burned, and converted to maize fields, and this threatens the wildlife, fauna and flora in this area, and including the critically endangered mouse lemur, which is the smallest primate in the world. You know maybe that Madagascar is one of the most richest countries in terms of biodiversity, but it is totally endangered right now, and corruption is hitting hard. The corruption scheme leading to this heavy deforestation can be described in a few words. There are migrants from different parts of the country who are hired to come and to plant maize in this protected area, from which any kind of culture should be forbidden because it is protected theoretically. But then you have huge cohorts of 20, 200, 400 of people coming there, and they are paid by local authorities to plant that maize. The maize is then bought by companies for turning it into beer, sold on the national market, and also sold at the outside. So it is a circuit that we have been discovering and reporting to authorities already, but as such authorities are bribed, what can we do? I mean, there is no expectation on the rest. So a former member of a parliament named Député Leva was part of those authorities who are bribing those people to plant into the protected area, and he was also bribing the policemen, everyone. So now in that map, you see the difference of the land forest from 2009 and 2020. Now we have more than 50% of forest loss in this protected area, and it is accelerating, currently speaking. So the second case, and this of course accelerate the effects of climate change in the region, because it now subject at the same time to heavy droughts, but also to the loss of the fauna and the flora, as I said previously. So the second case, in a few words, is more related to mining this time, because there is also a huge link, a nexus between mining, loss of land, and corruption. So we have this Rio Tinto and QMM mine located in southern Madagascar, owned by 80% of it, it's owned by Rio Tinto and 20% by the Malagasy government. And it started to operate almost 20 years ago now. So there are recurrent protests in the Anusi region, in this Mandena region, and those protests are mainly related to grievances for loss of land, loss of livelihoods, no fair compensation for all of these losses, health problems related to the mining. We suppose that the water may be poisoned or contaminated by some elements driven by the mining, and there is a collusion between the company and the government, preventing a right and fair treatment of those grievances and conducting to unrest, perpetual unrest in this region, one of the poorest of the country. So here as well, we have this scheme between power, corruption, land grabbing, and the population is totally marginalized in that scheme. So there is something to do about it. As I'm speaking, there are some risks of new unrest in this region because people are not happy with the tentative agreement reached by the government, the company, and themselves in May of this year, but which implementation is not satisfactory. And to conclude with this first part, I will say that those who are complaining about the loss of their lands in Madagascar, may they be community, villagers, activists, or from the civil society, face harassment, judicial harassment, and also threats, maybe from the government or from the companies. So it is dangerous in Madagascar to claim your land rights, and it is a shame.
Thank you so much. I think you brought a number of factors into the equation, what you're talking about. You talk about how eviction is happening, land grabbing is happening, and also you talk about how political corruption has become part of that. And also you said about bribery, which is happening, and that exposes the loopholes in administrative structures in terms of transparency in administrative structures, and how that is exacerbating land corruption. One of the points that you actually have mentioned also about the food system, the food agribusinesses that we have created, and how that is affecting local food system, right? Land has been taken from communities and been invested on agribusinesses and feeding people in many richer part of the world. And we do hear cases from Brazil actually, how Amazon has been encroached to produce soya, and that soya has been sent to the UK for poultry farms. So thank you for bringing that. And then when you clear this forest land, its impact on biodiversity. And the last point that you have mentioned was you showed a map and how the forest density is decreasing, and who is doing that actually, the extractive industries. And recently we heard from Southern Africa the stories of Ogiek people and how they have been expelled from their traditional land, and how extractive industries are encroaching into it. So let's talk about solution in a minute, but I don't want to create the picture that we are against businesses, we are against any kind of investment, but that's not the idea. But we're talking about having a people-centric approach to our work, right? But I think from there, we're moving on to Zimbabwe, and we got the executive director of TI Zimbabwe, Tafadzwa, in Zimbabwe, Tafadzwa, land grabbing has been a state-sponsored business for a long time, right? But I just want to divert your attention a little bit because we talked about forest land, rural communities, but this is also an issue which is happening in urban and peri-urban areas. Can you tell us a little bit about how land grabbing is happening in urban and peri-urban areas as well?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Rakshana. I do agree with you that the land question in Zimbabwe, it has a very long history in terms of the politics of our country, to the extent that it is the reason why probably people went to war. And of course, at independence, there was an agreement that probably land should be given back to the blacks. And of course, the process took longer. And of course, it gave birth to the land reform program of around 1999, 2000. And of course, in that process of land redistribution, it was actually meant to correct the imbalances in terms of land ownership. But of course, in the process, it resulted also in multiple land ownership. It also resulted in double or multiple allocations. It also resulted in illegal acquisitions of the same land. But of course, by extension, and based on a research that we did jointly with the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, focusing on corruption in urban and peri-urban, we then established that there are a lot of similarities in terms of political corruption that happens in land redistribution. And we realized that there are a couple of issues which I will highlight in my presentation. And of course, we noted that the procedural acquisition of peri-urban state and private land. Land in urban and peri-urban, it's either this is state land, it's either local authority land, or it is private land. But of course, there's been a lot of acquisition of state land by individuals, especially those that are politically connected, either within the ruling party or within the opposition itself. And of course, it creates a corruption risk in that regard. There are also violations in terms of standard procedures for allocating land by council officials. So they're allocating land without following specific procedures. And this resulted in some of the council officials actually being arrested for the same cases of corruption. And we also noted procedural and corrupt change of land use. There are different land uses in urban and peri-urban. But of course, individuals, based on their political power, would easily convert the land use and, of course, allocate land the way they actually wanted. And of course, this is facilitated by, broadly, what has been termed as land barons, those that own huge tracts of land, and also, cooperatives. People just form cooperatives with political alignments, and of course start distributing land. And of course, the poor and vulnerable groups, they usually fall prey to such cases. We also witnessed allocation of land on wetlands, an area that has been left out. And of course, either private sector, which has money, comes in, convinces politically connected persons, and such land is allocated to them. There's also allocation of land on people who are not on the waiting list. In urban and peri-urban, people have to go to a waiting list, and when your time comes, then the land is allocated. But you'd realize that they were not following the waiting list. And of course, surprising enough, with state land, we discovered that there are instances where there were actually issuance of title deeds to individuals on state land. So this is also a specific case. And also subdivision and allocation of state land by the beneficiaries of the land reform program, especially those that are closer to urban centers. They parcel out land and actually sell the same land to individuals, yet this is still referred to as state land. And of course, there are several cases where the poor and vulnerable fell prey to land barons by way of paying huge sums of money to them to acquire private land. But in the process, they paid land, but the land was never delivered to them. And of course, we continue to have people who are not benefiting, and of course, the corrupt continue to benefit from the process. And of course, I want to mention this, which is quite critical, that in urban and peri-urban, land itself is actually being used as a political tool, especially ahead of elections. So people are lured to vote for certain political parties on promise that they will get land to build their houses, and immediately after elections, that land is taken back from them. And sometimes even when people build, their houses are actually demolished. So moving on to consequences, of course, I've talked about demolition of houses. Someone corruptly acquires a piece of land, sells it to unsuspecting public, and of course, when the city council verifies and find out that the land is not probably meant for such, the local authority comes, destroys the houses, despite how huge investments have been put on them, and of course people lose their houses. And I've mentioned the issue of allocation of land on wetlands, And of course, that has a major implication in terms of climate change. And of course, this has resulted in poor urban planning, because there are certain pieces of land which were left open for certain purposes, but of course, because of corruption, people come in and occupy those pieces of land, resulting in poor urban planning. And of course, in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe is for a long time known for good urban planning, but this has actually taken us back. And of course, I want to continue stating that the poor and vulnerable groups in our societies continue to suffer. And of course, this continues to exacerbate cases of political capture. When the private sector comes in, they actually acquire land because there are corruption risks associated with that. I thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Explaining to us what's going on in a thumbnail expression. So what you basically said was political corruption and how state capture is actually exacerbating land corruption in Zimbabwe. And also you touched upon how procedural and administration rules have been manipulated to benefit people who are in power and people who support them, and how it has become a political issue. Also, I think what you tried to explain at the end was because of all these things, there is huge inequalities. This is contributing to inequality in different ways. So there are a lot of people in this room, and including myself, I think some of us work on policy issues at international level, coordination of work, and I think it's extremely important for us to listen to people who work at the ground level and think about in our policy work, what does that really mean to listen to these ground level stories and how we can really make real policies to bring changes. So with that, I'm going to move to the solution part of that, and I'm going to look at Joachim. We do understand Brazil is a big country and hugely complex, like many other places in the world. So finding solutions is also a huge problem. So there is no one single fitting jacket. There are arrays of issues. But when you come to administrative issues, inclusivity is extremely important. And coordination within administrative authorities. Can you tell us a little bit about, in terms of tackling land corruption, how important it is that?
No, thank you very much. I think, yeah, indeed, inclusivity should and must be at the heart of the land administration system, because, as I said earlier, that there are many indigenous people, local communities that are living on and from land, and small farmers that are not visible in land cadastres and land registries. And so when they're not visible, it's often because they don't have a formal title, but when they're not visible, they don't exist for the state. And so they are very vulnerable to land grabbing. And very often, those communities are located in what we call undesignated public land, which is basically land that are not allocated for any specific use, and on which the state doesn't really know who live on those lands. You can see on the map on the left all those undesignated land in Brazil. So it's quite in the Amazon region in Brazil, sorry. So it's a lot of land. And you can see on the right all deforestation that is occurring on those undesignated areas. So you can see a clear relationship between the two. When you move to deforestation data, can you switch to the next slide, please? You can see that deforestation, which again can be considered to be a proxy for land grabbing, is concentrated in those undesignated areas, and about 87% of deforestation is occurring in those areas, while in indigenous lands and in conservation units, which is also home to local communities that have their collective rights that are recognized, deforestation is much lower. And it's not because those areas are smaller than undesignated areas. They are indeed much larger than the other ones. So I think that a key solution is really to look at regularization and to in particular the regularization of collective rights, so that you can actually move from the very vulnerable public lands to those that are much more protected from deforestation and land grabbing. And those processes must be participatory as well, and include all the communities that are affected by those regularization process, to make sure that you limit the risk of abuses against those communities. And I mean, this is a very difficult process in Brazil. It's very complex, it's very time-consuming, and it would take years, if not decades, to resolve. So I think we need to look at other solutions as well, to make sure that collective rights and the right of informal landholder are recognized, even when they don't have a formal title in land cadastre. So it's very important to think about that, and to have some reporting mechanisms that are safe and accessible for those communities to report attempts of land grabbing. And just, it's actually, when you look at the political context in Brazil, it's just the opposite of what's occurring there. You have the Bolsonaro government that didn't demarcate any indigenous land in his administration, and his administration also removed all the indigenous lands that were in the process of demarcation from land cadastres. So it just makes those lands much more vulnerable to land grabbing. So I think that we are at a turning point in Brazil with the new administration that is coming, and it's very important to put the right of those communities and this approach of anti-corruption on land issues at the heart of what is this new environmental governance and land governance that is getting built in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joachim. It reminds me, I was at COP27, and the president-elect was there, and he said in 2025 he wants to have COP 29 or 30, I can't remember exactly. He wants to have it in Amazon. And for people to see real issues. But politicians do make promises, but I really hope that they will become a reality. I just want to keep this slide. I want you all to have a look at it. And there's a brilliant point that you made. When land is looked after by local communities, indigenous peoples, real owners of land, they really look after that, and that's really beneficial. And according to my organization and FAO as well, there is documented facts that when land is looked after by indigenous people, local communities, such land sequesters more carbon than land which has not been looked after by. So the message that we get is, if we really want to stop land corruption, please pass the ownership to local communities, right? Indigenous people recognize their land titles and give them the real ownership. Because these communities have been looking after this land for centuries. It's our modern economic way of living has destroying the planet, actually. But these people have been living in harmony with the land for centuries. So thank you very much for bringing that issue. And I'm going to move to Kay. Kay, as I said, there is no one straight jacket in solving the problem. There are an array of issues. Tell us a little bit about how do you tackle this issue in Madagascar?
Yeah, okay. Before giving my answer, I would like to comment a little bit on you just what said on local ownership of land by communities. It is very important, I do agree. But there is an additional thing which has to be done, especially in countries like Madagascar, the poorest ones, is giving communities as well sources of revenues other than the forest. Because in my country, for instance, people are so poor in some parts of the countries that they burn the forest and eat the lemurs because they don't have anything else. So yes, give them land titles, but also feed them. And this is the responsibility of the government, period. So now, solutions. What we chose as one of the solutions to tackle corruption in land in Madagascar is to opt for investigative journalism. It is something which didn't really exist before 2018 in Madagascar, and it is our chapter which promoted it as a tool for advocacy and also for anti-corruption. So we created our own network of investigative journalism, struggling a bit because there is no school for investigative journalism in Madagascar, just, conventional journalism, but we wanted to do it. So we were looking for partners and benefited from some small training from various organizations. Still struggling because most of the trainings are in English, while our journalists only speak Malagasy and French. But anyway, we have been producing more than 70 stories since 2018, and all contributing to combating corruption. 1/3 of those stories, those investigations, are related to land corruption and land grabbing. So a success story maybe. You remember the story of that member of parliament that I just told in the first part, the Deputy Leva in the Mena Bay and Mena protected area. So we filed an investigation on him and on the maize culture that he's doing in the protected area. And thanks to that investigation that we did with other organizations, saw the importance of coalition as well. The deputy was arrested and prosecuted, not for corruption charges, but because he had lots of guns and ammunition in his place, and also because there were lots of people who dared to testify against him because he was doing really kind of terrorism in the region, imposing this culture of maize within the restricted area, and also by importing, if I may say so, those migrants from other regions invading the region. So he was sentenced to only 2 years of prison for murder, not corruption, but murder. So murder weighs 2 years in Madagascar of jail because he was a member of parliament and he had some immunity. So that's another problem, impunity, because all judges, I won't say all, maybe 90% of judges can be bought in Madagascar. This is really something which makes the fight against corruption harder. But investigative journalism can be a real powerful tool because it goes not only within the country, it goes beyond. And it gives us the opportunity to raise awareness about the case of our country and of the political corruption as well. But it is very risky also for the journalists. So one of the solutions would be also to, adopt a protection law for anti-corruption whistleblowers, including journalists, investigative journalists, and also defenders, because we had the case of the assassination of Henri Rakutuarsu, a 70-year-old defender, environmental defender, last June. He was beaten to death by 30 people. And we know that there was a case of land grabbing hiding behind this murder. So yes, this is a solution, but it needs more additional, measures to work. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that. I think, as I said at the very beginning, according to Global Witness, more than 200 land and environmental defenders were killed in 2021. And just before this anti-corruption conference started, on Monday, a land and environmental defender was killed in Guatemala, who was working for Codeca, and he was killed in front of his home. And he left behind 4 little children. So you can understand, these are the people who are actually standing for the planet that we all share and the price that we have to pay. So incredibly important what we have brought forward in terms of a solution, but also how important to protect the lives of these journalists and the work that they are doing. I think I hope that we will have more time to talk about it. And I'm going to move to Zimbabwe in terms of solutions. You talked a lot about corruption, collusion between elites and how it is contributing to land inequality. Tell us, in this context, what would work as a solution? An incredibly difficult context.
Okay, thank you so much, Rakshana. I think I've noted that there are a lot of similarities in terms of our challenges, whether you're in Brazil, you're in Madagascar, or in Zimbabwe. And of course, the solutions that they've proffered actually applies across the board. But I think from the Zimbabwean perspective, some of the major beneficiaries of corruption, as I've mentioned earlier on, includes the land barons that I've mentioned. It includes cooperatives, especially those that own the cooperatives, and also private land developers. And for us to trace who these beneficiaries or the output beneficiaries or natural persons behind these private companies, cooperatives, and land barons, sometimes it's very difficult to establish. So as Transparency International Zimbabwe, we recommend that there should be a register for those that own the private companies, those that own the cooperatives, and of course, those that are behind the land developers themselves. So we are looking forward to beneficial ownership transparency. I'm happy to report that in Zimbabwe, we reviewed our Companies and Other Entities Act to include provisions for beneficial ownership disclosure. And within that particular law, we feel that there should be beneficial ownership transparency to ensure that we trace who the natural persons behind these entities are. And of course, I have also mentioned that the major corruption risk that we identified through the research that we did was the existence of a multiplicity of institutions that are actually responsible for land governance in Zimbabwe. And this includes the Ministry of Land, Ministry of Local Government, Regional Town and Country Planning Act, Department of Fiscal Planning, the State Land Office, and of course governed by different pieces of legislation. And of course, our recommendation strongly is to ensure that there is consolidation of legal and institutional frameworks to ensure that we have a designated entity that oversees the allocation and governance of land in urban and peri-urban, to ensure that there is consistent transfer of land, either from state land to local authority land or private land. But as it stands with a multiplicity of these institutions and legal frameworks, it's actually very difficult to trace. I thank you.
Very good, brilliant. So two solutions: beneficial ownership, and then also when it's come to administrative structures. Again, you highlighted on the fact that how do you make it more transparent and accountable to the people. I think I'm going to open the discussion now, so you can make a comment, or you can ask a question. You can ask a general question, or you can identify a speaker when asking the question. When I look at the audience, there are people who work internationally, maybe there are people who work regionally and nationally. There are arrays of solutions that we can come up, and also how we can support each other in our work based on your expertise and your experiences. I think it's really good to put that onto the table. I know there are people who are working at national level, there are people who are working on sanctions, who are people working in international regulations here in terms of climate change. So let's bring that discussion together, how we can strengthen the work which are happening at the national level. And right, we have one question here. If you can pass the mic, that would be great. Please identify yourself, name and the organization.
Hello. Thank you so much for all the information you've given us so far. My name is Neha Wadekar. I am a Nairobi-based independent journalist doing a lot of work on climate change across Africa. And but my question is really for everybody. I am working on a story at the moment that is looking at land grabbing, but from a slightly different perspective, which is how companies and governments might be grabbing land in the name of protecting the environment. So in this case, there's an oil company that's working in Central Africa. They are trying to plant a forest of 40,000 hectares in order to kind of offset the carbon that they're putting into the atmosphere. Our understanding is that a lot of indigenous communities have been displaced. So that's just one example of some of the things that we've heard of, like, you know, another one would be mining for the minerals that we need for electric vehicles, right? So it's like this new kind of displacement that's going on in the name of protecting the planet. So I'm wondering if you've been seeing that, what you think of that, and what solutions might be implemented to address and mitigate that before it gets out of control, unless it already is out of control.
Thank you
you.
for asking that question. I think it's really, really important to talk about that. We get about 2 other questions and we move on. Yes, ma'am. And you are noticed next, but first, you.
Thank you very much for such an interesting topic. My name is Mary Mundea. I am a journalist based in Zimbabwe. And my question is, from what I gathered in regards to what the various panelists said, the problem of land grabbing is prevalent the world over. And what do you recommend be done on an international level as far as curbing such is concerned, because we have issues? For example, in the country where I come from, as much as the issue ended up being relatively fixed, the issue of allocating mining rights in a game park, where, you know, it's one of our biggest national reserves, and coal mining companies were actually being given mining rights in that particular game park. It's happening the world over. What would you recommend be done on an international level? And my second issue, as far as that is concerned as well, is that whilst we are moving towards finding recommendations in regards to what can be done to solve the issue on an international level, it's also important to take in the context of the local people who have been cohabiting in various environments with animals, for example. And sometimes we put in regulations that we ignore the fundamentals of what happens on the ground. I will give an example in Zimbabwe, for example. There are various communities that have been cohabiting with animals for years. And due to population growth, we have now seen a rise in the issue of human-wildlife conflict. That Zimbabwe is actually one of those countries with the highest level of human-wildlife conflict in Africa, because of the scarce resources from water, all emanating from climate change, among such issues. So whilst we are moving towards finding recommendations, I would also suggest that we look at the context of what the local people are going through, and we pass legislations that will safeguard them, because as far as I'm concerned, they are the custodians of these environments, and they've been staying in them and taking care of them for years. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're going to move to you. But before that, I just want to say that we have a virtual community as well. Alice, do we have any question from there? We will ask in the next round. So far, we don't have. Okay, we're going to come to you, sir, in the next round. But first you, yeah. Can we pass the mic to her, please? We have a very good chunk of time for conversation. So, yeah, half an hour. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful panel so far. I've already learned a lot. My name is Chloe Zoller, and I help lead a coalition of human rights and anti-corruption organizations documenting for sanctions and other forms of accountability. My question's a little broader than that. I'm wondering if you could tell us more about the gendered impacts of land grabbing and, in general, these malicious practices by the government and other actors. And similarly, what type of gender-sensitive approaches to solutions should be considered given these impacts? We've heard a lot about indigenous impacts, and I know that it all intersects in many ways, but could we talk to a gender lens on all of this, please?
All right, so let's move to the panelists first. Do you want to take any of the questions?
I can
Any
take the
comments?
question on green grabbing, so on all those land grabbing schemes that are related to so-called green projects, whatever they can be, such as the compensation for another project. So I think one of the solutions is what I've mentioned, so really to work on the recognition of land rights of the communities that are living there. And I think we have a role to play as journalists, but also as civil society to raise awareness about this issue, because I think there's not that many people that are talking about that. It's not on the people that are talking about those solutions for climate change do not consider that much those land issues. So, and I think there's a role of certification companies to be more aware and to consider those corruption risks when they certify those carbon credits.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I just want to talk a little bit about that in terms of green grabbing, which are happening. So I think one of the ways that we try to tackle the problem through our organization is to put in the people at the center of carbon offsetting programs and net zero programs. So none of these programs at the outset should not be a ground for land grabbing, right? Or we call it these greenwashing programs, because they shouldn't be a ground to expel people from their land. I think let's get that right. That's fundamental. And if any carbon offsetting program fundamentally going to put people away from their land, we cannot qualify that as a carbon offsetting program. So I think that has to be the fundamental framework that we have to work on, right? I know there are people from the Green Climate Fund here, so we want to hear more from them about that maybe. And the second one is that if people do have tenure rights for their land, their vulnerability become less. They're less susceptible to thrown around in terms of carbon offsetting programs. So it's important for sometimes territorial rights or individual rights of these people to be recognized. So land tenure is so important in that context. And also when we talk about carbon offsetting programs, I mean, these people do have their own solutions, right? So we don't need to bring new solutions. So we need to think what has been working. So ecosystem restoration is important in climate change program. But if you talk about ecosystem restoration, please turn to the local communities and their knowledge and what knowledge that they have been using for centuries to look after the ecosystems that they have been part of, right? So, yeah, go ahead.
What if it is not for the particular project that we are looking at is not one of the World Bank kind of, internationally run projects, which from what we understand does take the time to do due diligence, even if it might take a very long time to implement. This is actually a private sector company, and you probably know the kind of company that they are, right? This is an oil and gas company that's trying to undo the damage that they already do. And, we spoke to somebody, off the record who basically told us, we flagged this to them. We told them that they need to do an environmental impact assessment and a community impact assessment, and they really don't care. And because they have government support, because they bring in so much money to this particular country, the government's very happy to go ahead with it. So what happens then when the forces of business and government align? How could a community ever fight against that kind of power?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that. I'm going to make it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can totally relate to this case because this is happening in my country, and that's why I was speaking about a collusion between companies and government, not only in the mining sector, but in most active sectors. So what we want to do is first to empower and to make citizens aware of this scheme, this is not normal and we should not accept or let it be. Of course, educating the citizens takes time. That's the tricky point on it when, bad things happen in a snapshot, but good change happens in years. It takes years, but we need to find solutions, and the solution will be a stronger alliance between CSOs, formal or informal ones, and grassroots-based communities like we do. Let's do something together. An example of it is what we've been doing through Transparency International in Madagascar and Publish What You Pay. We conducted a research on that mine in the southern region of Madagascar, and then we documented all the violations of human rights which occurred them with the permission of the government. I'm saying permission because there is something called the National Office for Environment, which is supposed to monitor what the company is doing, but they are not doing it the proper way because most of the budget for that national office comes from the mine itself. So how can there be any kind of independence in that scheme? So we documented this case, and we are now advocating at the international level to, put pressure on Rio Tinto and QMM to make them change things. And we tend also to shame the government for what they are doing. Something more may occur to me than by saying this, but that's a reality. We really need to stop then by increasing awareness first and leveraging pressure at the international level, because locally we can say what we want as civil society, as grassroots organizations. They are not caring, as you said. There are lots of money going between the government and companies, especially ahead of a year of election. Like in Madagascar, for instance, we will have presidential elections next year. So all the private sector and the politicians are already in a kind of seduction move, like who is going to back whom? And then the community is the one going to pay for all of this political corruption and collusion. We have to stop this. And also, I think seizing the international human rights mechanisms can be something helpful. We have all of this whole range of special rapporteurs for whistleblowers, defenders, human rights. We can seize them, international, but also regional levels. And that might work or not, I don't know, but it worth a try. And regarding also the gender impact of climate change and all of this land grabbing and corruption, we know, for instance, we mainly work on anti-corruption, and we know that women are more vulnerable to corruption than the others because they lack resources, they lack education, and most of the time in our society, for instance, men run away ahead of problems because a lot of poverty, climate change, for instance, so there is less water, for instance. They just flew away to the big cities and leave their wives and children there, so more burden for women. This is like a daily and very concrete impact of climate change encouraged by corruption. So, of course, solutions have to be adopted with a gender lens, but there is also a kind of maybe another form of education or conscientization within the society, telling that men and women have to face together the effects of climate change and corruption, and something should be done on that. Maybe starting with young kids once again, because they will be the future leaders. And oh yeah, it's tricky. There is no miracle solutions on that, unfortunately.
Right. I'm going to move into you, but I know how frustrating it can be when we cannot find solutions. But at least if we can expose, and also just to say, like, we all have to be very careful when these big companies have CSR programs and how they can be greenwashing or window dressing. So thanks for bringing that and that.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much, Rakshana. I like the fact that you brought in the issue of green grabbing. Something that happens, and the picture that is given to the society and community is that this is good for the community. And of course, within the business and human rights framework, there's an aspect of free, prior, and informed consent. And I think that has to be respected across the board to ensure that the private sector and government does seek free, prior and informed consent from the communities before any investment does take place. And of course, this has to be a priority. So I wanted to add my voice in terms of green grabbing. But of course, to just also mention that, corruption is a very sophisticated crime to the extent possible that, on a daily basis, there are new forms of corruption that comes into place. And of course, they come in by lowering individuals in terms of accepting probably what is unacceptable. Then the second issue with regard to international frameworks, I think vis-a-vis what she mentioned, having a mining company come and probably set up within a game park. Within our Zimbabwean law, mining supersedes every economic activity. And to the extent that even if you have any form of investment and there is capital underground in the form of minerals, you have to get rid of that economic activity and then mining has to take place. So I do strongly feel that within the international framework of governance, for instance, within the African Union, the African mining vision should actually cause member states to adopt a standard law that ensures that we don't have that precedence where mining has to supersede everything. And of course, that has to cut across a number of other international and regional frameworks. Lastly, in terms of the gender implications, of course, women are on the receiving end in terms of corruption, both in urban and peri-urban, and also in the rural areas. And of course, we need to find solutions in terms of ensuring that as part of the decision-making process, women should actually be at the center. I remember during the opening session where Delia, our chairperson, raised a concern that we need to involve the vulnerable groups, especially those that are at the receiving end of corruption. And of course, in our next meeting, I'm sure we should have those to air their views. I thank you.
Okay. Before going to the next question, he wants one point.
I forgot something. I was so passionate about the case. Regarding transition minerals, it is a real danger for poor countries, poor extractive countries like Madagascar and others, because the run through this energy transition in the north will translate to more extraction in countries like ours. Madagascar, for instance, is producing lithium, not lithium, but nickel and cobalt, and the rate of extraction may increase in the upcoming years, while we don't have the adequate policies for facing this. So I encourage you to read the statement on transition minerals that published What You Pay. We prepared for the COP27, so it's available online, but I also have a few copies here if you're interested. There are practical measures and recommendations for governments and companies embedded in it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So before we pass that, I think the world has seen tremendous progress in terms of gender equality, in terms of land ownership over the years. But in terms of implementation, there is much more to be seen, because some of the land ownership is being controlled by customary laws. And even if the law allows, customary laws don't actually allow women to have a real ownership in reality. So one example is that during the COVID, we saw like reverse migration from urban areas, men coming back to rural areas again, and then how they started like having the ownership or getting the control of land that women have been using for home gardening and family farming and for the issues which are priorities for them. But there is documented evidence that if women do have ownership of land, how it has positive impact on their families, how it can increase the spending in the household, and how it can increase the education of children, and how it can impact positively on health of the household if women do have the land tenure rights. Okay, so we're going to pass the mic to you first, sir, and then you. Yeah.
Geoffrey Maimba, my name's. the chairperson of Transparency International Uganda. I do want to appreciate your presentation this morning, and also to appreciate the fact that the issues you're raising are the very issues we deal with daily in my country, in the case of Uganda. And I appreciate that what is happening somewhere else, either in the case of Brazil or Zimbabwe, we are facing the same challenges. So the issue is cross-cutting, not only a threat to human rights, but also it's a national security issue that is so powerful and very challenging to deal with. And my concern actually goes back to the former speaker, the person right there who raised the question, government grabbing land from the local people, probably in the name of development, in the name of an investor. We face that. Right now, in the case in point in Uganda, we have a pipeline running from far away in the west to Tanzania. And many people have been evicted. People have been not compensated. And it is chaotic. It's a very big concern. It's a security issue. My question is, the problem we have, the problem is not that we don't have support systems in place, community systems in place. They are there. What plan? Because community systems are there, right from the local level to the bottom up, or from up to down. Judiciary is in place, parliaments are in place, local administration is in place. What recommendations can you offer to remedy these kind of situations we face today, whereby we are faced with the migrants, like she said, in Madagascar, it is in Uganda, from people from Congo, from where coming to Uganda. What plan do we have to strengthen these support systems to ensure that we remedy the situation?
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Janet Joel. I come from Zimbabwe. My question is really related to the issue of checks and balances within this this sector, in looking at the challenge of the land grabs. I am saying this related, I think you said something in terms of giving the local rights in terms of ownership of land and the traditional ways that we used to do it. But I think generally the economy has really changed, or the political economy, so to speak, when you put in the politics into it. It's very seldom in extractivist economies where everyone, where they are sitting, they want to extract. So it's very difficult to point a finger, for example, at the executive and say you are abusing your power and taking land without three fingers, you know, pointing at you. And this could be the legislature, this could be the judiciary, this could be civil society from where I'm coming from, because everyone is just extracting. And at the local level, traditional leaders who are the custodians of the land in that are implicated as well in land corruption, in land grabs. I have cases where we operate, where traditional leaders like chiefs are taking land from widows. As soon as your husband is dead, they are removing you from your homestead and from the land and giving to a land baron, because it's a peri-urban area, and the city, for example, is expanding into the peri-urban and rural areas that are close by. And I'm just thinking, so what is it that we have to do? What's the best model? Are there any models from the researches and the work that you're doing in terms of where communities are empowered at that level of ownership of land, having land, but probably as well holding accountable and saying, how are we building those movements? How are we building from the bottom in terms of having communities resist? Because it seems like the political economy at all levels, local authorities, as Tafadzwa was saying, councillors, where they are also just taking land and parceling it out. It's everyone, it's extractivism. And I'm just wondering whether what is it? What are our solutions? What are we saying?
Yep. Do we have any questions online? No. Yes, sir. So in this round, let's see, we have another round after this, hopefully. We have about 10 minutes. Yeah. Yeah.
From your intervention, from the question in the room, you measure how important it is to work between civil society organizations and journalists. How can we still improve in that cooperation? Thank you very much.
Okay. Excellent. So let's hear from our panelists. Any responses? I think they're very broad questions in terms of what you can really suggest in this context. But I think here they asked the question of like how the empowering citizens can be important in this context. Yeah. So do you want to take first?
Yeah. Frankly speaking, I don't have answers, guys, because this is the $1 billion question. What is the plan? What to do? I might be very naive or like utopist, but I think that it's all about this culture of money and everything. We have to change our way of thinking as societies, as communities, like what is the most important to us? It's not profit. We have also to rethink the scheme of development that we want. What do we want as development? I'm saying this because when we did that research in the mining affected area in southern Madagascar, people kept saying, these are villagers without any kind of instruction, the development that the mining company wants to come to bring here is not the one that we want. And because the company is doing like CSR actions, trying to substitute one source of revenue to another. And they said, no, we just want to keep our identity and keep continuing what we did. We used to plant, like rice, for instance. We don't have our rice fields no more, and we have been reallocated a plot of land, and the company wants us to raise paper. But we don't care about paper because it is not part of our identity. That's what the community said. So we don't need this development. That's the words of this population, and it made me think a lot about that concept of development. Maybe this is a key to a change, because maybe donors have to rethink how they feed the country, if they subsidize it, what do they want to subsidize? Does it fit the real needs of the population? Once again, the CSR policy has to be reframed as well along to fit the needs of the communities. So it is a global rethinking of our way of life, a way of living, and thinking of development that we have to start right now before it's too late, in a sense. So regarding investigative journalists, I think that a movement like ours, Transparency International, has to really feed them into various kinds of knowledge, because corruption is transversal, it is everywhere. So those journalists need more background from sectorial side, like in the mining, what they do have to know about corruption in the extractive sector, what about in the health sector, in the education sector, in whatever sector. So our chapters, our movement, I think there are lots of resources that we can share with them at the international region level, for instance, because we have those outlets like OCCRP or ECIG or other structures that can collaborate with the movement, and then at the chapter level, we disseminate also this knowledge nationally with national elements but also elements, pieces coming from this international collaboration. But this has to be continuous because it's not an easy job. Doing an investigation takes sometimes a year to complete. So we need resources to pay the journalists as well. It costs money, so more funding for journalists is also required. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move to other speakers. But just on that point, I
Yeah.
think today the word journalist also has expanded, right? So
Yeah.
we had like where people, print journalism and having TV, radio. But I think there's something called citizen journalism today, where people have a camera and a video, go around, create a story, put them on the public domain, and then people can see that. But how do we create, in terms of stopping corruption, a responsible citizen journalism, particularly among young people? I think I just want to leave that idea with all of you. But I think you want to respond? Yeah, and you too as well.
I just noted that the questions were becoming difficult, I think, towards the end, and requiring a lot of thinking in terms of responding to them. But I think it's about the broader value system in terms of development. It's not just about the anti-corruption activists and anti-corruption institutions. This is about the broader development framework in which, as countries, as civil society, as anti-corruption institutions, we need to locate ourselves within that broader framework and ensure that policies and legal frameworks are there to protect the interests of citizens. Where policies and frameworks goes against the will of the citizens, I think it becomes a problem. And we need to recruit as many people as we can. We need not to remain in our comfort zone and probably work with anti-corruption affiliated institutions. But of course, let's think about how young people can feed into this discussion, how women can feed into this discussion, and of course, how the private sector can also feed into the discussion, so that the broader developmental framework that we need as economies is something that values the people themselves, the citizens, and of course, the need to improve the cooperation between citizens and investigative journalism. I think it's a new developmental framework which civil society is adopting, and as members of Transparency International, we are ensuring that the role of journalists is actually fully embedded in our work to ensure that the voice of the voiceless is actually amplified by facts and information. So I just wanted to emphasize that let us not only be limited by the frameworks within which anti-corruption activists and institutions work, but of course work from outside. I thank you.
Brilliant. Joachim, your responses.
So,
and I'm going to open the floor for one last discussion after that. Okay, Joachim.
So I think like a lot of the comments touch upon the question of accountability. And I think we talked about inclusivity and putting people at the center of land issues. And I think it's extremely important, but we haven't mentioned the issue of holding the private sector accountable. Because actually, I mean, I'm talking about the context of Brazil. I'm sorry if that's not totally the same as other contexts, but I think there are some similarities. But land grabbing is often the first step of a more complex part of an economic network, and the areas that are land grabbed are often used to produce commodities that end up in global supply chain. So I think, and all those commodities, they end up in global supply chain with fraud and corruption to hide the illicit origin of those commodities. And you can think of timber, you can think of soy, we talk about soy, we can think about the beef industry. So you have all those processes to hide the illegal origin of those commodities, because it's not legal to produce beef or soy on a land-grabbed area. And I think we really need to hold accountable those companies that produce, of course, but also those who buy. And I think it's interesting that now we have this debate at the global level. I think more at the European level too, with the due diligence laws to make sure companies have due diligence obligation to make sure that the products they buy are not committing human rights abuses or environmental abuse or, in other parts of the world. And to touch upon the issue of journalists, I think journalists have done an amazing job to evidence that. And for us as an advocacy NGO, it's very important, the work of journalists, to use that as part of your evidence and to advocate for change.
Brilliant. So one last round of questions. Please be very brief. We have one gentleman over there. Anyone else? Please show your hand. I believe that there are no questions virtually. Okay. Last two. Please brief. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thank you for the lovely panel. Patrick Dijkmans, Code and Transparency based in Ecuador. Not very recently, someone was willing to pay $2 million in Ecuador to become the next vice minister inside of the Ministry of Agriculture. Very deep down inside the ministry is where the rural land is assigned. Mm-hmm. And not too long ago, in a panel in New York, the former president of Colombia said that we need to look into cadastres because rural land is a lot, because that was basically focused on climate change. And rather than a question, there's a proposition I want to tell you. Ego is a very powerful tool, and a former president looking to be positioned in this climate fight, talking about cadastres puts him in a position, because his nexus with the World Economic Forum and certain technology companies, to implement systems and to push the agenda with multilaterals as well, to transform how cadastres work and to have independent entities that through technology can make the transparency a key part, and perhaps give the tools to the journalists and to everyone as a society. So just to give you that's, I think, some way we can work to and have this problem be more visible. Working with, for example, former president, forgot his last name.
Bolsonaro. So, President of
Colombia, sorry.
Colombia. Okay.
Former president.
Thank you for that. And I think last question. Yeah. Please be brief. We have 3 minutes over.
Yes, very brief. Just to say thank you very much to the team for a marvelous work. Well done. I believe Alice and the land team deserve commendation. My name is Mary. I am from the TI chapter in Ghana. And to say that the issues mentioned here are very common to us, but then to also ask, the issue around political party finance and the nexus between political interests and also the grabbing of land is a common feature. From your jurisdictions, are there, or even from the room, are there any best practice examples that we can learn from here, so that as part of the solutions we can carry along, not just the beneficial ownership and also awareness raising, but others which have been done where we have seen results that we can also adapt in our advocacy towards ensuring that political interest, which features highly in the grabbing of land, is dealt with. Thank you.
Brilliant for those comments. I think we need to wind up very soon. Before passing the mic for the final words for the speakers, we want to evaluate this session because we really want to make ourselves better in the future in terms of bringing better ideas, better discussion to you. So please tell us what you think about the session, how we can improve the session. If you can go to www.menti.com, and they will ask for a code 71044729, and you can give your feedback. Please do that. That's would be immensely valuable to us. Okay, so we got 2 good comments. Maybe we can summarize that in your responses. If you want, you can respond. But if these people who are here in the audience want to go out of this room, they want to take one message with them for the day and for their work, tell us, Joachim, what would that be message from your end?
I take the opportunity to talk about land cadastre as well. I think it's a very important issue and a very technical issue that is very complicated to address as civil society, but also journalists. And I think what we try to show here is to connect this discussion about land governance with human rights, anti-corruption, and environmental agenda. They're not separated agenda. They must work together. And you know, you cannot protect the rights of indigenous people, local communities, and other people that suffer from land grabbing without addressing the corruption that is behind it. You cannot fight deforestation without addressing corruption that is behind land grabbing and without making sure that you protect the right of the people who live in the forest. And you cannot have carbon markets that are working if you don't have, again, you don't make sure that you're not fostering land grabbing and you're not violating the rights of the communities that are protecting the forest, basically.
Wonderful. For you, any responses plus to what's the message that you want to give to the audience?
Okay, like I mentioned earlier on, as the conversation rages on, I think I'm finding it very difficult to respond to most of the questions. I need to admit that. But of course, to just say, with regard to political party financing, this is an issue that we grapple with in our own countries. And in the presentation, I've also mentioned how land itself is used as a political tool to lure voters during the run-up to elections. And of course, the private sector that contributes financially ahead of the elections, they are rewarded in different ways. And one of them is being allocated land after the election for the support. But of course, my closing remarks are that, as civil society organizations, we do have a very specific role to play in terms of influencing the legal and reform process, not just in terms of land grabbing or land governance, but across the governance architecture. And we need to leverage on that and ensure that we explore both local solutions and also regional and international frameworks for governance. So those are my closing remarks. I thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, for me, regarding the political nexus, political corruption, we have just developed in Madagascar what we call an integrity pact for the private sector in political finance. So we just launched it the 2nd of December before traveling here. I can send you, Mary, a copy of it if you want. But the idea is just to engage the private sector, saying don't contribute to the state capture and to harmful practices made by the government or politicians. So if you give money to them, disclose how much you gave and to whom and for which purpose. So for the moment, not a single company has signed it, but I remain hopeful. We have just started this campaign in prevision of elections for next year. But that's the idea we have. I don't know if it will work or not, but that's what we are trying right now. So the message for me is very simple. Corruption undermines each and every human rights. So we are always talking about SDGs, but none of these SDGs will be achieved, frankly speaking, in our countries, especially in Africa, if we don't really tackle corruption, being very serious about it. It's not just a secondary issue, it's a main one for every single problem in this world. So let's do it seriously. And the solutions, the three of us and all of us already thought of it, empowering people, empowering also investigative journalists, and getting rid of corrupt politicians. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I just want to leave you with, in addition to all these brilliant ideas, two messages. We talk about family farming. We talk about this big industrial farming and food system. Do you know in the world today, 60 to 70% food is produced by family farmers, not by industrial farming. I mean, some people say 75 according to FAO, so there's a controversial pushback, but I can confidently say that 60 to 70 food is being still produced by family farmers, and these family farmers are actually feeding large amount of people out of the 8 billion in the world. Think about that. And second one, 50% of the world's surface is being looked after by indigenous peoples, local communities, pastoralists, right? Out of that 50%, only 10% have secure land rights or territorial rights. Think about that, out of that 50%. And this 50% is responsible in stopping the climate change because that land is sequestering a lot of carbon. So my message is that secure land tenure for these small farmers and indigenous peoples, pastoralists, and local communities. Let's give a big round of applause to these 3 brilliant people who brought stories from ground up.
Thank you to you.
Thank you very much. Please visit the website of Transparency International and their land page, and we can find more information about that. Come and meet and talk to these people if you want to talk and share more information. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.